Raphael Fitch. Author Kevin D. Raphael Fitch was born in Mount Vernon, New York, the hometown of Sean Combs, Denzel Washington, yeah, and the late Heavy D, yeah, Dick Clark, yes, and Art Carney, to name a few. Fitch, who goes by Raphael, has Fitch, who goes by Raphael, has acted in stage productions, commercials, and movies. He was given permission by Gibran National Committee in Beirut, Lebanon, to dramatize Khalil Gibran's book, The Prophet, and present it as a one-man show called An Evening with Khalil Gibran. Published in May of 2012, Raphael began writing his book, Celestial Configurations of Africa and the Caribbean, in 2008. This book, an astrological perspective on the development of the African nations, is considered to be an unprecedented volume of astrological literature which unites history, story, scientific astrology, and numerous references and citations. His work, now considered a reference work and even a textbook, has been given high praise from political science professors, writers of philosophy, and esoteric literature, as well as some of the foremost astrologers in the world. Raphael?
Well, there's a scripture in Ecclesiastes 12:12 where it says, "Be wary of the reading and writing of books, because the writing of books is humongous, it's enormous, and it continues." And Solomon, who this scripture is attributed to, is quoted as saying, "Too much study is a weariness of the mind." And so I ended up writing this. This book is something that I backed into. I didn't plan to write this. I was planning to write about a thumbnail of this, because there is a subject that has never been covered before in detail and specifically about Africa, in terms of the horoscopes of the African nations. Now, there are many astrologers throughout the world who have done horoscopes of the nations, Europe, Asia, United States, but no one had ever did a book about the horoscopes of Africa. And I got the idea back in 2007 in December to put together 50+ charts chronicling the birth times of independence of these African countries. And I was going to just put it into a spiral notebook, take it to Office Max or Staples, have them bind it, and then sell it, because I knew there was a market for it. So I ended up doing that. What I didn't know, as a writer, is that you have to make sure that you really get your citations and your references down, because people read this book, they're going to want to see footnotes. They're going to want to see where you got the information. So what I did was I contacted every major African embassy in the U.S., spoke to liaisons, diplomats, and some ambassadors to African countries. And I was able to secure times based on reading over 300 books. Didn't read them cover to cover, or else I wouldn't be here today. But I read enough to make sure that I had at least 3 or 4 sources for my books. And for those of you who are writers or aspiring writers, you might get something from this tale of mine, that the references are really key to establishing your credibility as an author, especially for a book that covers a subject like astrology. So, many of you have probably seen the movie A River Runs Through It. Well, a narrative runs through this book. It's not just nonfiction. It's 622 pages. And yes, it could put some people to sleep. But I desired to write this book in such a way that if I said something, I had to define it right after, so you wouldn't get lost. So there are many parenthetical pieces in here. So if I say something about the 12th house, I define what it is, so you can continue to read and you don't get stopped in your tracks. Originally, this book was for astrologers, because I've been an astrologer since 1981. And then I realized that you don't just want to keep that niche so small, you want to expand that niche to include maybe historians. Maybe they'd be interested in the history of African nations from an astrological perspective. And so that's why I say I backed into it, because once I saw those 50 plus charts, I said, that's not enough, I gotta do more. And so I did more, and I ended up writing a little piece about the African country. And then I was dissatisfied with that because even that wasn't enough. So I ended up spending 4 years on something that I only planned to be involved with for 2 months. But fortunately, with the help of my wife and her support, she kept encouraging me, just keep doing it. If you don't feel it's right, continue until it is right. And so this is the result. What I'd like to do is read a piece regarding James Madison and the war between the states. And I believe this will kind of give you a feel for the book. And I had the page a while back. Similar situation to my friend over there, Pam Lyman. She was looking for a page 2 in her book. So you just allow me a few seconds here, if I can find it. It's always good when an author knows his book. And Brother Raymond, could you give me a hand signal for the 1 last minute, when I have my last minute, so I can...
I'll just do the stop symbol.
Okay, a stop symbol is good. Okay, I'm going to skip it for a moment. Ah, nope, that's not it. I'll start from the preface. This is not exactly what I desired to read, but I'll start from the preface. Should I, Master? I don't believe in astrology. Sri Yukteswar said, it is never a question of belief. The only scientific attitude one can take on any subject is whether it is true. The law of gravitation worked as efficiently before Newton as after him. The cosmos would be fairly chaotic if its laws cannot operate without the sanction of human belief. The above exchange occurred in a quiet place in northern India, where stillness reigned supreme. Sri Yukteswar, a master of Jnana Yoga, divine wisdom, exhorted his disciple, Paramahansa Yogananda, to have a special astrological bracelet made to wear on his upper arm. It was to be composed of certain jewels and metals, and like a talisman, proposed or purposed to ward off the approaching rays of certain planets, which were going to be unfavorable to him. The book contains conventions that I put in the beginning, such as stated in the acknowledgments, the first iteration of this book was a list of charts after a very short introduction. Pertinent highlights of historical content were included to make the charts more intelligible. Maps and photographs were added, and a unique feature was to state the distance in miles from one capital to another. This serves to evoke a feeling of connectedness and flow as you study the countries. So what I did was, after every country that I covered, when I went to the next country, I wrote the distance from that particular state's capital to the next, in kilometers and miles. This is threaded throughout the book for both Africa and the Caribbean. So I'll read a portion of Djibouti, which is in East Africa. And by the way, the charts are arranged according to their region. There are basically 6 regions, actually 5 regions. The African Americans here in the U.S. are considered the 6th region of Africa, as wide as it's kept. So, Djibouti. In Djibouti, wind speed is a term where physical expression is rarely seen, except in cases where a cyclone brings its heavy rains and wind in a counterclockwise demonstration of large-scale violence. The air usually doesn't move. Combined with a maximum temperature of 100 degrees on her Independence Day, the repeated mantra of "Long live independence" was quickly followed by diminishing levels of outward enthusiasm. Some authors have described Djibouti's air quality as dense enough to check the flight of a mosquito. Author David Lamb wrote about the sluggishly flying mosquitoes that could be easily caught in flight, and also because of the intense heat of tired prostitutes. The French territory of the Afars and Issas will be known as the new nation of Djibouti in minutes, as it is now 11:58 p.m. on Saturday, 26 June 1977. The Issa-born leader, Hassan Guled Abtitan, was prime minister up until 72 hours ago, when the Chamber of Deputies elected him president. In Djibouti, 340 miles, 558 kilometers northeast of Addis Ababa, at the southern gate of the port of Djibouti, Hassan Guled Abtitan watched as the tricolor came down, then silence, then applause, as the new national flag signaled a new day for his nation. Djibouti is wedged between Ethiopia to the south, Somalia to the east, and Eritrea to the northwest. He negotiated with the French and the representatives of the Afars and Issas to fulfill the ultimate plan of independence. The right man was picked for the task of uniting these Red Sea states. Abtidan was a Libran, if his birth date is true, and he played the role of negotiator and peacemaker between Somalia and Ethiopia. The French, and more importantly, between the Afars and the Issas who couldn't get along. His new nation on the coast of the Gulf of Aden near the Bab el-Mandab, the 12-mile zone where more than 70 ships pass daily, was located in a very strategic part of the world, making his new nation a tenuous one. So, I like to give a certain degree of acknowledgement to the authors Lee Child, Tom Wolfe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Francis Bacon. The reason I say that is because in this book, I desired to take you into the feeling of what it was like to be in these nations when they were given independence. So the book is kind of a tour throughout Africa, astrologically and historically. So you get a sense of what it was like when thousands of people who were under colonialism through the European powers of Spain, Italy, Britain, France, and Germany and Belgium, were at that point where once that flag came down and theirs came up, they would celebrate their new independence. So here's another one. This is Morocco. Now this is a little interesting because at the time I wrote this, I had been doing a lot of research on Morocco. And at the time, Morocco changed presidents or changed kings. The astrology of the country was so key that I said, there's no way I cannot write about this. So this is a piece on Morocco. Moving northeast from Alexandria, Egypt, across the border of Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria to the royal palace of Rabat, the capital of Morocco, a distance of 2,134 miles, 3,435 kilometers. We come to another kingdom whose king was called away from his throne rather suddenly, but not in the manner of King Idris or Farouk. For King Mohammed V made his transition from this world at 12:05 p.m. on Sunday, 26 February 1961. This overwhelming event occurred when Morocco's natal Saturn, representing the king, came into power under a Saturn Mahadasa, major period. Now this is a Vedic Indian astrology term representing a cycle of Saturn, which is a very important and sensitive part of the horoscope of Morocco. Saturn is in Scorpio, which in the Vedic system is considered as an unfriendly placement. Scorpio also pertains to surgery. And the sidereal chart, sidereal meaning constellational chart, the king's passing coincided with transiting Mars, ruler of sharp surgical tools, opposed its natal position in the 5th house, 8th from the 10th position, and when the two planets transiting Pluto, symbolizing death, and transiting Neptune, anesthesia, simultaneously trined and opposed the midheaven that represented the king. Around December of the previous year, King Muhammad V was advised by his personal physician to normalize his hours of sleep instead of working so hard. Often, the king worked from one day straight to the next. And to that advice, the king is quoted as saying, "You know well that it is quite impossible for me to follow the regime you advocate. How can I even take time off from my work to rest?" Through hard work and discipline, the king had won independence for his country and was respected by the majority of Moroccans, as well as the heads of state of many nations. The king was on the operating table undergoing a septoplasty, a minor operation to resection the nasal septum, the wall of cartilage that separates the nostrils. Sidereal Aries sits on Morocco's natal 10th house, which is the seat of executive authority. The Mars transit, opposing its own natal place, its own position in the horoscope, brings the 10th house, which is the king, into an intense association with the Scorpio-ruled 5th house, which is surgery. When the king's son, Muley Hassan, took power, on that day, transiting Neptune, anesthesia, was opposed to progress midheaven, King Muhammad V. The transiting son, Muley Hassan, was square the natal midheaven, the king, and was conjunct the 8th house, the house of death. The king's son assumed power after the death of his father. Muley Hassan, who became King Hassan II, had been groomed from childhood for this enormous responsibility, so spectacularly illustrated by progressions in transit. So progressions are when you take a planet on a particular day and you progress it 1 degree for a year throughout the longitude of space. So primarily, the story that runs through this book takes place in Libya. And the person who's writing this book is the character who's sitting in a Libyan cafe. And he's writing this entire book that you are reading. So when you read the first part of the story, you'll read how Ahmad Jones, an astrologer from New York City, is sitting in a Libyan cafe writing this book, word for word. And he meets what can be considered a guru. And his guru's name is NIWA. And throughout the entire book, you read about how Ahmad and his guru NIWA are discussing various aspects of what's going on in Africa and how there can be a resolution of conflict in all the African nations. So what actually follows and moves through the book is the concept of brotherhood as the resolution of all conflict. And that if all the African nations would be able to see beyond borders and beyond various religions and various practices into the core of the heart and have the reverence for life within each individual, there would be a much easier way of bringing a greater sense of brotherhood and unity throughout the African nations. So this book, even though it speaks about the astrology of coups and political shifts that have occurred, it also speaks about brotherhood as the key to the resolution of conflict. So that's a little on the book, and I hope you enjoyed it, and be available for any questions you may have later. Thank you.